Right, well, we're out on the bank today for the latest edition of Skill School. What I brought us here today, I brought us to a typical open water commercial. So we've covered lots of snake lakes and various other little methods, but today I brought us to a nice big open water where I'd like to concentrate on the correct ways of feeding, on my approach to feeding. I will try and create competition for the bait that I've fed. I will try and make my peg last as long as possible, and how I hopefully try and not make the wrong decisions during the match. The things that I look for to tell me to what's going on during the day, and hopefully lead me to catch more fish and not mess my peg up, which I've definitely been guilty of a few times in the past. So what I want to cover mainly first is how I like to begin my sessions on these sorts of venues. It's a very simple way of fishing on here. I mean, I've got very few options. I've got a nice big open lake. So of course I've got the options of fishing down the edge. I've got the options of chucking rods in the middle of the lake, which I'm not going to concentrate on them today. But mainly I've got two options on the pole. I've got short and long, say the edge as well, but we're not going to cover that. But yeah, short and long on the pole, and how I go about fishing both of those lines, and when I feed them, what I feed them with, all that sort of thing. So first all I want to cover is the bait that I choose to target these sorts of fisheries. For me, there's one, I fish pellets. It's what I'm most confident in, and I definitely believe they're the most versatile bait I can possibly use for getting the bait to work in different ways. There's no other bait that is as versatile as a pellet is for either sinking quickly, sinking slowly, or grouping on the bottom. Lots of different things that I'm going to cover now. So firstly, we're going to grab the cameras and go through the bait that I choose for a typical session on this. A few little tweaks I do, and the little tiny things that make my bait behave in the correct way to catch the fish how I want them. Right, so like I said, first up, I want to talk about the bait that I choose, or the pellets that I choose for how I want to fish this typical venue. So this is a very standard commercial that you see up and down the country with a high stocking of proper common and mirror carp, which is quite unusual for the northwest, but that's what we're fishing for here. So pellets are definitely, for me, the number one bait. There's nothing else that can catch as many fish as pellets can, in my opinion. So what I've got myself here, I've got two different types of pellets, but one of them prepared in a completely different way. So I think it's very important to have pellets that behave in different ways when either fed into the water or when they're sat on the bottom. Really, if I'm going to fish on the bottom, then I want a nice heavy pellet that's going to get down to the bottom quickly in most circumstances, and break down very, very slowly. The last thing I want to do is feed a pellet that breaks down into a ground bait within 5 minutes, because then I may as well feed ground bait, and the fish have got another option of a different bait to use instead of eating what I can potentially fish on my hook. So by having a hard pellet that breaks down slowly, I'm always fishing the same hook bait over the top of my pellets, which there's no odd one out. I mean, I'm more likely to get a bite because I'm fishing a proper bait among the right type of feed. So my chosen pellets for doing that, for fishing on the bottom solely, is a hard Coppens pellet. So I've gone with 6 mils in this case, mainly because of the size of fish that we're fishing for. They're all caught between 2 to 6 pounds. So a nice 6 mil pellet is about perfect for that sort of fishing. But so my Coppens pellets, they're my choice as my slow breakdown pellet that sinks very, very, very quickly, but also stays as a nice cylindrical pellet on the bottom. So they're going to be my starting bait for feeding in a certain way, which I'm going to cover in a minute. If I choose to fish in a different way, either shallow or the fish want to feed through the water, then I can change to a coarse pellet type thing. These are my Bag & coarse pellets, which are the Skrettings type pellets, which are a much quicker breakdown of pellet most of the time in their usual form as they come straight from the bag. They break down very, very quickly. They also sink very, very slowly as well. They're quite a buoyant pellet, and they don't necessarily float, but they sink very, very, very slowly to the bottom, which in turn, if I'm fishing them in the wrong situation, i.e. I want to fish just on the bottom, a slow sinking pellet gives the fish opportunity to raise in the water, eat my pellets before they get to the bottom where my hook bait's being presented, and it can lead to all sorts of problems, to liners, foul hookers, whatever else. So these need to be used in the right situation and prepared in the right way, depending how I'm going to fish them. So in today's case, I've got some nice plain, straight out the bag almost, Skrettings type pellets. I mean, normal coarse pellets, they've had a tiny little bit of oil added to them, literally just to get them to break through the water, the surface of the water, the tension of the water. They will still sink very, very, very slowly. They're going to be my ideal pellet for fishing on the drop, or possibly fishing shallow if it gets nice and sunny later and if fish want to come up. They're my pellets to choose for that. So it'd be pointless me using a Coppens pellet for that sort of type of fishing, for shallow fishing or through the water, because it sinks so slowly. It sinks so quickly, sorry. It go down too quick, and it minimise the time that the fish have got to inset them pellets and probably keep them on the bottom rather than bring them up, which would be the last thing I want if I was fishing in that way. The last pellet that I have is, again, a coarse type pellet, Screttins type pellet. These have been really, really heavily oiled pellets. I've added a lot of oil. I just use plain normal pellet oil to my pellets, and that makes them really, really, really heavy, very attractive, quite slimy. They've got a lot of oil in these pellets, almost like trout pellet type pellets. They're going to be really attractive if I want a slightly smaller pellet than a 6mm coppin, and if I want to catch a few smaller fish, if some skimmers are in my peg, if any other fish are present, I find that coppins can be a little bit selective for catching anything other than carp and F1s. So by having a highly oiled Screttins pellet, they're my third option for if I need to fish on the bottom with the Screttins type pellets. So by having the 3 different types of bait, all my options are potentially covered. I've not just got one type of pellet that does all. I'm always going to suit the type of pellet to the way I want to feed, which is what I go into next. Next, I'm going to go through my rigs, how I'm going to feed with each type of rig, and in that way how I'm going to respond to how the fish are feeding, and just show a few things that how to keep the fish coming instead of fishing the wrong rig at the wrong time. Right, next, so I want to move on to the types of rigs I want to use for depending how I'm going to feed my bait and how the fish are feeding. So I'm very lucky in this case. I'm just going to feed 2 lines and they're exactly the same depth, which ideal well, that's what I'm after. It saves me making 2 extra rigs. So for my short and long line, I've got one line about 8 meters. I've got another line or potential another line about 13.5 meters. All my rigs are going to cover both the lines because they're the same depth, so nice and easy. So what I want to start is by talking about how I want to introduce my bait. There's pretty much only 2 ways of introducing bait into a peg. There's either by putting a small pile of bait in, adding just a little tiny bit of bait, keeping it in a really accurate pile, and presenting the bait very steadily over the top. That's what I like to call setting me trap. So I'll fish in that way to begin with and see what's feeding. And then secondly, if that doesn't happen, then I need to loose feed and attract fish into my peg. By loose feeding, it'll make the feed fish, or it'll give them the opportunity to feed in a little different way, in that because I'm making some noise, there's more regular bait going in, they're more likely to come off the bottom. So I need rigs to cover both possible scenarios of how the fish are going to feed. So like I say, to begin with, this is my first way I'm going to feed. I'm going to cup in a little tiny bit of bait and I'm going to sit there and see what happens. I'm a big believer in not rushing into a match, not rushing into covering every single option as quick as possible. I like to feed some bait and literally sit there and watch what's happening. I mean, none of us can get it right from the start of the match. So by keeping my options, or the fish's options, minimal, by feeding a few pellets in one area in my peg, what I'm doing is I'm creating the maximum amount of competition possible for those few pellets, because there's only one little bit of pellets in my swim for any fish that are feeding. But I'm reducing the options they've got. I'm not spreading them all over my peg, losing track of what's going on, and it gives me a better understanding of how the fishery is actually going to, or how the match is going to progress, how well it's fishing, whether there's much eating to begin with or not. So this rig, this is going to be my nice cupping in, keeping my bait tidy rig. This is a very, very stable float. I've got a nice 4x14s, nice wire float, which is lovely for 4 foot, 4.5 foot that we've got in front of us. So a nice shallow lake, not too deep on here at all. So a 4x14 gives me plenty of weight to keep my bait nice and still. And that's simply shotted with spread number 9 shot, all in the bottom third of my rig. So it's a nice positive rig that's going to help to present my bait in the correct way. I mean, because I'm feeding such a small pile of bait, excuse me, so I'm feeding such a small pile of bait, I want a really stable rig that's going to hold it over that pile. It's almost like creating a mini method feed, if you like, on the bottom of the lake. And I literally sit there and wait for a fish to come and stumble across it, eat all my bait and get a bite. And I'll repeat that process over and over again if it's right from the day. If it's not right, then very quickly I can start loose feeding, which may be all right. I may carry on catching on a nice stationary rig loose feeding, but I'm more than likely to catch fish through the water, or they're going to pay a lot more attention to my bait falling through once I start loose feeding and making a bit of noise. So if that were to happen, I can simply swap to a nice little light rig, which is a nice 4x10s float, which is just shotted with 4 number 10 shot spaced all the way through my rig. So a really, really nice light rig that's going to present my bait in a as natural way as possible through the water. So the 2 ways of fishing, or the 2 ways that the fish could possibly feed, are pretty much covered. Yeah, I've got the first rig, I'll keep it nice and stable, really accurate, let me see what's going on in my peg, whereas the second rig will let me catch fish both through the water and on the bottom. So it's a nice versatile rig that can do a bit of everything. The last rig that I set up, just in case to cover things up, is a nice little shallow rig. So because it being proper carp here with no F1s being involved, I can have a nice, simple, basic shallow rig with a decent length of line. I can move that float up and down, and I can search a little bit if I feel that the fish are intercepting those pellets and not going to the bottom at all. So I've always got the option of catching a few shallow just in case they come up. So pretty much everything's covered. So what I will mention though that I didn't touch before on bait, that I should have definitely said, is that at some venues you do have to be careful. Of course, there's so many venues now that sell fishery-owned pellets. It's definitely worth asking what their pellets are, whether they're Coppens or whether they're Skrettins variety. If they're the Coppens, then you have no choice but to use them straight from the bag as they are, because with Coppens pellets, they really do not like taking oil on. They simply don't suck any oil in, so you end up with a very slimy, very difficult to use pellet. The Skrettins, on the other hand, like I said, they're really versatile. You can get them to do everything. So just have a play, have a word with your fishery, see what they allow you to use and judge it accordingly. But right, onto the fishing. We'll have a little play. Right, now I'm going to start my session exactly how I'd start a typical match. I fish here really regular. This is actually my regular venue at the moment. I love coming here and competing in the matches here. I'm going to start exactly how I'd start any normal session up at this particular fishery, and indeed 99% of the commercial fisheries that I visit up and down the country. And I'm simply going to band a 6mm Coppens pellet on the hook, because I'm choosing the Coppens pellets to begin with, because the way I'm going to introduce my bait. All I'm going to feed, half a dozen 6mm pellets. That's plenty of bait to get a bite. I say that the less bait I feed to get a bite, I'm just going to cover them in water just to make sure they really sink as fast as possible. Yeah, the less bait I can feed to get a bite, the higher the chances of them picking out my particular hook bait. Obviously, if I feed 100 pellets, it's 100 to 1 chance. If I feed 6 pellets, it's 6 to 1 chance of them picking my hook bait out of that pile. So I'm going to be really accurate. I'm going to put that bait in, perfectly in line with my far bank marker. And because my rig's nice and stable, I can literally line my float up with that and sit and wait. I mean, I'm not going to lift and drop. I'm not going to do anything whatsoever other than keep my rig perfectly where I want it. If it moves off that pile, then there's less chance of me getting a bite. As I said, I'm always trying to create the method feeder type effect, in that I've got a tiny pile of bait with my hook bait pretty much dead on top of it. That's what I'm trying to achieve at all times. And with a bit of luck, one will stumble across it and I'll get a bite. I say what I was going, have a bite, and that's nowhere near the bottom, but that's a good sign straight away, even though I foul-hooked that one. It's a really good sign that they're coming to the bait, but also that they might not want to feed in this way today. They might want to be high up in the water, they might want to be shallow because of whatever. So every little thing that happens for a reason, and I can almost learn from it, so what my next move is going to be. But that said, all my decisions, I don't want to make any decisions too quick. So I will try this method of feeding again, putting that little pile in and just see what happens. So even with a foul hook, I just play it in exactly the same way as you would if it were in the mouth. Just nice and steady pressure on him, and if we're lucky, we'll get him in, and if not, he'll ping off. By keeping my pole nice and low, if he does ping off, there's less chance of anything happening to my rig. So by only lifting up at that very last second, there's less chance of any rig damage going on, which often happens with these foul hook ones. I'm going to get him, he's right in the tail this one, so we're definitely getting him in. He's a start, definitely not the right way. I'm not going to do any posing with that one, because that one almost, that doesn't count. If I haven't caught it properly, I'm not happy. I'd say the beauty of them 6mm Coppens is, straight after catching a fish, I'm good to go. I mean, as long as my pellet's not all snotted up, I mean, it's not breaking down at all, it's still a nice, lovely, solid pellet. So I'll just make sure my band's in the middle, and he's good to go. There's no need to change that pellet whatsoever. I'm going to repeat exactly the same thing that I did before, literally 6 pellets in my cup. So get my rig, swing my rig right out into the lake, get him out the way for now. Get my bait in that perfect little pile where I want it. And then let my bait lift my float, let my bait swing in right on top of that pile where I want it to be. So this way of feeding perfectly lends itself to the tricky days when it's not going to be really good, when there's not a lot of fish feeding. You're making the most of every fish that comes into your peg, because pretty much every fish that swims into that small pile of feed, I'm going to catch most of them. I mean, odds are every fish that comes in is going to eat all the pellets that are there. So it is very good for them 40 and 50 pound days when you don't need a lot of fish. You're making the most of your peg and you're not spoiling it by spreading bait all over the place. So what I am very mindful of now is, what I want to do is constantly have an understanding of how many pellets are actually in my peg. Because I've actually fed, how many have I fed? I've fed 12 to 15 pellets now. That's all I put in my peg. With that one I caught, I don't actually know if there was anything on the bottom. So there's potentially 15 pellets on the bottom in my peg now, which leads it 15 to 1 for me to get a bite. So what I don't want to do is continually keep putting more and more bait in every cast if what's on the bottom isn't getting eaten, or the vast majority of it isn't getting eaten. Got a proper bite then. There's a big lift up bite that. What's in the mouth? So yeah, let's say the last thing I want to do is the pellets to build up so there's too many on the bottom. If there's 15 on the bottom now, and I go back in and feed another 15, then there's 30 pellets, which is 30 to 1 chance of me getting a bite. If I do that again the following cast, then it's 45 to 1. So it builds up very, very quickly of just how many pellets are on the bottom. And even on catching fish, I need to know that it's all getting eaten and I'm going to get a bite as quickly as possible. So next cast, I'll try and feed 4 pellets maybe and cut it back. Because I'm constantly after the smallest amount of bait to get a bite. Yeah, these commercials are definitely not about putting big volumes of bait into, especially in open water. The margins are a little different, but in open water, if you put volumes of bait, all you're ever doing is giving the fish lots and lots of options of baits to eat. So there's so many fish in these venues, there's always going to be one close by. So by keeping the options limited for them to feed on, there's more chance I'm going to get a bite quicker, and I'm also going to prolong the life of my peg. He's typical of the stamp in here. Let's say 2.5 pound. Proper one. Same again, nothing wrong with pellet. Pellet's good to go straight away. As you could do with trimming a little bit. Sort that in a bit. Just trim an inch off that. Same again, this time I'm just going to feed 4 or 5 pellets. Just to see what reaction it has, see if I can get a bite off that small amount of bait. So we're all guilty of upping the bait. In most situations when we start catching, we think, oh, there's more fish there, feed more bait. It's, in theory, the completely wrong thing to do, because all you're going to do is either fill them up quicker or put too many options on the bottom. So by going in the opposite direction of cutting your bait right back to not nil, but as little as possible, I'm going to make my peg last a lot longer. There's less chance of messing it up by fish grubbing about in the silt or anything like that. And I should get bites a bit quicker because of it. Right, well I've caught a couple of fish feeding in this way. This is my 3rd fish feeding in this way. Which in a competition, I'd be happy with. You know what I mean? I'd plod on. I mean, my target here generally is 30 to 40 fish. So catching at this sort of rate, it's going to give me 6 or 7 an hour, which is it's lovely. It's going to be bang on. Because it's all suiting to what's happening on the day. But, so for the filming purposes today, he's a proper little fat boy. Yeah, he's like me, look. Hey. Yeah, for filming purposes today, I want to show what I'd do if nothing was happening, which often is the case. It's often a little bit quieter. It's often a much slower and steadier start. So I'm still going to cup in my pile of bait, because I still want to be nice and accurate. So I'm going to put just 4 pellets I'm putting in there now. But to make something happen, I need to bring noise into the equation. Like I say, this would have been, it's not required for how my peg's behaving, but we're not here to catch a load of fish today. So I'm going to put my bait in. Assuming nothing's been happening whatsoever, what I need to bring into next is the noise element. I need to try and attract some fish by making a little bit of noise in my peg. So I could do that by cupping my pellets in from a little bit of height, a little bit of a rattle, which is great. That can drag a fish into my peg. That's the first thing to try. Next off is to start loose feeding just a little bit of bait. And I'm literally just going to feed 1 or 2 pellets. That's all I need to throw. Just by feeding 1 or 2, I'm still only adding a tiny little bit of bait to the numbers that are already present on the bottom. But I'm making a nice little plop, plop, plop on top of the water that's going to drag new fish into my swim, but still without spoiling it by chucking loads and loads of bait. So just by a couple of pellets right over the top of my float, or as close as I can get. See, I'm still trying to present a pile, pardon me, but the bait falling around it, or the noise of the bait falling around it, that's going to bring fish into my peg with a little bit of luck. What I am finding now is my rig's drifting quite a bit. It's pulling quite heavy now with this tow. Let's check that. So because my float's moving to my left, what I've plumbed up to just below the body of my float, just to allow me to, I'm going to put my bait into the right and my float into the left, still right over the far bank marker, over the pile. And in turn, my heavy pellet is going to almost act like a little bit of an anchor. So as my float's blowing along, or moving along with the tow, my hook bait's actually going to hold it in place a little bit better to save it moving through my peg too quick, and it's going to help me keep it over that pile. So straight away, even though I've only fed 2 lots of 2, I'm getting a lot more indications on my float instantly. The fish is so tuned in to that plop, plop, plop of the pellets going in, that straight away they want to have a look up right up in the air and see what's going on. They want to intercept them pellets. They want to be the first fish to the noise, because that way they get the bait. I'm just going to carry on feeding in this way just for 2 or 3 minutes, just to see what impact it has on my pegs. Because I don't want to rush into straight away picking my shallow rig up and going for it, or picking my other rig up and going for it, just not quite when it's ready for it. So by continually chucking a few pellets, I'm going to see what reaction the fish have and see whether I need to cut back. I may need to use the throw-in as a form of attraction to get the fish in the peg, and then once they're there, stop throwing and revert back to cupping in my little pile and sit and wait. Or if it's the sort of day when they want to be up in the water because the pressure's quite high, or it's nice and sunny, whatever else, I may need to revert to my other rig and catch fish through the water. That's the problem with this rig, is it's very, very unsuitable for catching anything on the drop because of how stable it is and the heavy shot that are down on the bottom. I'll see I foul hooked that one, which is no surprise whatsoever to me. To foul hook the first fish on that as soon as I've started loose feeding, because the fish simply aren't looking at the bottom anymore. They're looking up in the air. So I'm going to give it again one more try. 4 or 5 pellets in there. I'm going to make a bit of noise with these ones and just rattle them in. So I'm just going to see what impact that's had of making the noise again. So even putting that rig in then, as I put my rig in, something went through my line or had a little peck at my bait. So straight away there's fish on that. They're coming straight into the noise today. Which is such a good indicator of how they're behaving. Just picking up on the littlest things in that way, how the fish are behaving, lead me to making the right decisions. Because say you'd never believe that something so small as throwing 2 or 3 pellets could affect the peg in so many different ways, have such an impact on what ends up in your net. Let's have a little fat one. Proper beautiful one, isn't it? It's not in the mouth, just outside the mouth, that one. Time to same again, all on same pellet. I'm yet to change that pellet. It's the last time I'm going to try with this rig. Straight away, the guaranteed, just through me making that noise on the cup, my peg behaves in a different way with however I feed. Whether I sneak my bait in, nothing happens, I sit there and wait. If I cut my bait in quickly, then they're really up in the air, whizzing all over the place and giving me false indications. That's how we're throwing the bait, it's even worse, I'm foul looking bait. By trying those little tiny things so quickly into a session, it gives me a really good understanding of how they're feeding on the day and what I'm best spending my time doing, in what way I need to present my bait, and what rig I'm best spending my time on. So now I'm going to keep on throwing these pellets. So at the moment I'm still feeding my Coppens pellets, just to see this fish. As soon as I feed, every single time, as soon as I feed, there's something happening in my swim. If I'm feeding the Coppens pellets, I'm trying to keep them on the bottom. Next cast, I'm going to swap my pellets altogether, and I'm going to feed the slow falling Screttins type pellets. And I definitely believe that, see, at the moment, every single time that goes in, I'm not seeing any fish, but I'm seeing lots and lots of little indications telling me the fish are intercepting that bait through the water. There's lots of fish moving about as well tonight. Hey, look at that little fat boy. Look at him, Rich. Hey. But right, what I'm going to do now, because I feel that they are being a pain in the bum, because I'm not responding to what I should be doing on this peg. Definitely the best thing to do is to cut the bait and sit and wait. I'll be a lot more efficient that way. But just to demonstrate things, by swapping now to the light Screttins type pellets, the lovely slow sinking bait, and my nice slow sinking rig. What I'm going to do with this is just feed a little bit of bait before I go in. Same again, not much, 4 or 5 pellets. Right over the top of where I plan to go. A bit further than that. I'm laying my bait all the way through. This rig now is a lot more versatile in that I've got it could potentially catch plenty of fish going through the water as well. Because of my bait sinking nice and, or relatively naturally, it gives the fish a couple of extra seconds to intercept that pellet, and I may catch 10% of my fish through the water. Whereas with the other rig, it was limited to just catching fish on the bottom. But like I say, I've swapped my pellets to make everything, or to put all the odds in my favour. I'm feeding the correct bait for fishing in this manner. If I was to feed the Coppens pellets, they'd be going down too quick, and I'd just be catching fish on the bottom and just be getting a few problems with fish through the water as I was getting. With this one, everything's a lot more confident. The bites are a lot more confident because the fish are following that pellet all the way down and nailing my bait. But I often like to have a good play for the first half hour of a session, just to see what I'm best spending my time on, just to really see. It can be the smallest little changes or the smallest differences that let me catch fish twice as fast with one rig to the other. I mean, I'm always one that's looking for catching that little bit quicker or a little bit bigger fish, which you often find that you do catch through the water as well. More so with F1s than carp. But on so many occasions I found that the through the water rig catches the bigger stamp. Proper slippery little buggers today. There we go, lovely little one. I'll say, even with 10 pound of fish in my net now, within the first 20 minutes fishing, I can still judge what I've fed. I know that I've probably fed 30 pellets. I mean, so you need such a small amount of bait to make things happen. And it's that competition element that I'm getting at. It's constantly trying to create the most competition I possibly can for the bait that I'm feeding. So once more, I'm just going to chuck a couple of pellets before I go in. So I need 6 pellets. And almost like a shallow rig, I lay it right along. With this one, I want to lay it in a great big long line, so I'm constantly in contact with my hook bait. So it's following it all the way through. and then it's going to marry up right over my far bank marker where it was when I was putting my lumps of feed in. A few false indications. That's one thing I would like to mention as well, with little indications and things like that. I don't want to be striking it at too many bites. We're all guilty of being a little bit quick and wanting to catch fish as fast as possible. I'd much rather be a little bit more patient and wait for a really positive bite than to strike at everything at this time of the year and potentially foul luck half the fish I catch. Say foul luck in them is only going to, it's going to make me lose fish, but it's going to unsettle the fish in the peg as well in the way that the fish behave once I've hooked them, when they're very erratic once they've been foul up. Or I will say, this rig's extremely unstable today. Because we've got quite a bit of tow going on today, let's try it the other way. Because we've got a bit of tow going on, a 4x10 rig is very, very unstable once it's settled. It's blowing all over the place, which it's fine for catching fish through the water, but if I'm only catching fish on the bottom, then it's pointless me spending time on this rig, sorry. So that can also be a key element for me to making the decisions of what to try next, or what I'm best spending my time on. If my rig isn't performing in the right way. There's a lot of fish, they're really, really high up in the water them now. Right, now still on this rig, I've been on this rig 5 minutes, I've caught one. Straight away it's telling me this is very much the wrong rig to be on today. So I'm not presenting my bait nicely how I want to. I mean, once it's settling on the bottom, I'm not catching too many on the drop, I'm not getting too many bites on the drop. Once it's settling on the bottom, my rig's moving through too quick. It's pulling through really fast through the peg. It's not going to present my bait nice. So it's something that straight away tells me, get on the heavy rig, you want to keep it nice and still. The only other option I'd have though is fishing shallow, which I've actually had because I've swapped to these slow sinking pellets. I've had a couple of fish as I've laid my rig in, give it a little pull on my line. And I can see that they're intercepting bait really, really high up in the water. So I've got no problem whatsoever. Before I revert back to what I was doing, see another little pull then? Revert back to what I was doing with the positive rig, I've got no problem just having a quick 2-minute shallow just to see what's happening. So I'm constantly responding to the little things that I'm seeing in my peg. I mean, I'm seeing there's a couple of fish shallow, so I'll go and catch them. If I'm not seeing anything happen, I go back to what I was doing with that nice positive rig, sit and wait and come back with a fish. See, it's gone a little bit quiet now. Just as I was thinking about having to go shallow, I've stopped seeing any indications on my float. One more lift and drop. Now I'm happy that there's very few fish there intercepting the feed through the water. Oh, apart from that one. But within these 10 or 15 minutes, just by swapping, I can see how less productive this rig is. Yeah, I may be seeing a lot more indications than I was on the other rig, but I'm catching a lot less fish. That's what it's all about, is what ends up in my net. So it's great seeing loads of fish in my swim and bringing loads of fish into my swim by feeding, but I've messed my swim up because of it. So what I'm going to do now, that's the end of that. Just to show how important it is to be spending time doing the right thing, I've definitely proved in the last 10 minutes that that rig, the slow falling rig, although there's plenty of fish present in my peg, it's definitely not the right rig to spend my time on. It's not efficient, so I'm not putting fish in the net. So I'm quickly going to swap back to my positive rig. So same again, 6 pellets, swap back to my heavy pellets as well. Go back to the method feeder jobby of putting it in and keeping it neat over the top. And let's just see. So very quickly, I do believe in, whenever you're fishing these commercials, as long as you've kept it simple and not put a load of bait in, if you're doing the right thing, it's really obvious. Yeah, it's nice and quick, you catch lots of fish, and fish go in your net. When you're doing the wrong thing, that's also really obvious. Yeah, it's about working out what's best spending your time on as quick as possible. Hopefully, I've cut back. I'm not loose feeding any pellets by hand. The last thing I want is any more noise. I feel that I've attracted plenty of fish into my swim. I just needed to pin them down onto the bottom and say feeding that way, first cast, which is definitely shows perfectly how they want to behave, putting those pellets straight to the bottom, and I get a clean bite, which I wasn't getting on the other rig. A bit bigger, that one as well. So just on the subject of playing them and elastics, we're playing them as well. So I'm well known to be a big, massive advocate as fishing as light as possible when I'm fishing for everything, pretty much. That said, this year, I've definitely found that it's not so important with lines. I mean, I still like to fish relatively delicate. We're fishing 013 knuckle length at the moment. But I find that the light elastics are far more important. So say in this case, I say I'm fishing for fish 1 to 6 pound. So I'm using a much lighter elastic than most anglers would use. This is just rated at a 6 to 9, which it's really light and stretchy. But by doing so, I definitely feel it makes the fish behave better when they're in the swim. When I strike, they swim out my peg in a very, very docile, nice manner, which in turn keeps all the others in my peg happy. So when I go back in, hopefully I should get a bite a bit quicker. And still, as long as I'm using a puller kit, I can land them just as quick. I don't believe I'd have landed that elastic on much faster on fishing any heavier. So for me, it's the perfect balance of keeping my elastic nice and light, keeping my peg going, and getting the job done, getting them fish in the net as quickly as possible. But hopefully that was just a nice run through. So they behaved quite well, in all honesty, of how I'd start a session, how I'd want to fish a typical open water session on a normal commercial fishery with proper carp. Because say the long line is the next thing that could also come into the equation, but I would treat that in exactly the same way as I fish the short line. Apart from I may need to loose feed with a catapult instead of throwing by hand. There's also a better opportunity or a greater chance of catching shallow on the long line. So I'd always have that in mind as part of the equation. But what I'm trying to show is just how simple it is to get lines going. There's no reason for feeding big amounts of bait dotted all over the peg and bringing big groups to fishing in that way. It'll often just make them difficult to catch. So instead, by feeding minimal amounts of bait and just gauging your way through, feel what's going on in your peg, see what indications you're getting, you're always going to make much better decisions and hopefully end up much more in the net.